Chapter 2. The water was clear. Sunlight diffused through it like lemon juice. The liquid was warm and viscous. Tegan swam with increasing difficulty, her movements slowing as she struggled towards a surface that was not there. She had lost all sense of direction, and the light source had turned out to be the coral-covered expanse of the ocean floor. She twisted and turned, lost in the killing colour of the reef, her lungs bursting under the pressure, her eyes glazing. Then, as the strength slipped from her like the stream of bubbles rising from her mouth, she felt herself drifting, floating. As she sat hunched on the edge of a heavy leather armchair in front of the fire, Tegan relived the swelling terror of an afternoon swimming on the reef. She clutched a glass of brandy she could not taste, staring at the flickering of a fire she did not see. She remembered the raw panic which welled up in her stomach and slowly permeated her whole being as she realized she had lost all sense of direction. She began to swallow water and to splutter her life away. She was barely aware of the doctor and Kenilworth behind her as they examined the body of Nyssa, half heard their whispered discussions. But she knew she was sinking and that the surface was receding from her. This time she would not suddenly break free into the cool breeze of the Australian afternoon and gasp in retching lungfuls of air. It had been difficult to cope with Adric's death. But even that had been so much easier. She had not actually seen him, had not actually looked into his dead face and seen the calm, silent form which life had deserted. She had not begun to imagine the horror of his last desperate moments of existence, had not reenacted them in her mind and relived them in her imagination. In a sense, Adric's death had been remote, reported, something written in a book or seen in a film. It was a death defined more by his subsequent absence than by the event itself. But this was different. This was the mind-numbing loss of a friend brought home with vicarious immediacy. When Adric had died, it had been a sudden shock, and Nyssa and Tegan had been able to help each other to cope with the loss, had been able to comfort each other in their grief, had shared emotions which the doctor seemed unwilling or unable to risk. Now Tegan was alone, drowning in her grief. She sat before the fire, unable to bring herself to look at the coffin or the body of her friend behind her. She clutched the lead crystal of the brandy tumbler, feeling the gut-wrenching emptiness of the loss which she had refused to imagine the whole time that Nyssa was missing. She wondered how long the doctor had suspected the worst, wondered if he had somehow known, wondered why he seemed not to care. Then the doctor was there, kneeling beside her, folding his hands around hers as they clutched the warm glass. She could see for the first time the depths of emotion and the years of hurting in his eyes as he looked at her. She could see that he too felt the pain and the loss, even if he could not show it in the same way as she could. She knew that it would be best for him if he could give expression to his grief and voice to his pain and set it free. "Oh, Tegan," the doctor said. His voice was barely more than a whisper, flickering in time with the pale flames of the fire glinting off the cut facets of the glass she held so tightly in her fragile hands. As he held her, Tegan released her first painful sob. Her whole body convulsed with each heaving choke. She lowered her head till it rested on the doctor's shoulder and cried. "Why?" she managed to gasp between her tears. "Why Nyssa?" He shook his head. "I don't know, Tegan. I wish I did." The doctor turned and looked over Tegan's shoulder, back towards the sarcophagus still resting unmoved in the corner of the now deserted drawing room. "It's strange," he muttered. "So long, and yet so perfectly preserved." He shook his head slowly, still holding Tegan's hands around the glass. "It's almost as if—" His voice tailed off, and he looked from the coffin to Tegan, then back again. "I wonder," the doctor said, leaping to his feet. He looked back down at Tegan, brow creased in thought for a moment. Then his expression suddenly brightened. "May I?" He reached down and took the glass from her hands. Tegan thought for a second he was about to help her to her feet. But instead, he drained the brandy in a single swallow, smacking his lips together appreciatively. Then he handed her back the empty glass and dashed across the room to where Kenilworth was still standing silently by the casket. The doctor reached inside the coffin. "Will you time me, Lord Kenilworth?" he asked. "I'm going to feel her neck for a pulse again." "If you wish, Doctor." Kenilworth pulled a gold watch from his waistcoat pocket and flipped open the front cover. "There was nothing earlier." 4,000 years is a very long time. An induced metabolic coma would explain the body's preservation, and it would have to be extremely deep to be sustained for that length of time. "You mean she might not be dead?" Tegan put her empty glass down on the low mahogany table beside her chair and stood up. "Nissa's alive?" she asked. The doctor was staring into the casket. "It's possible," he said. "We did feel for a pulse just now, but only for a few seconds. Perhaps 30. In a coma this deep, there might be a pulse only once every few minutes." He paused, face creasing into a frown as if he was willing Nissa's heart to beat. "It's possible," he repeated. "Just possible." The bed was hard, made of some sort of rough wood. In fact, it was more like a bench than a bed. The smell of fish was everywhere, which might have given Nissa a clue that she was somewhere very close to Billingsgate, except that she was unconscious, and she had never heard of Billingsgate. She drifted into and out of awareness, her mind hovering between blackness and a misty haze. Sounds wafted through the gloom as she floated nearer to the surface of thought, mixing with the smell of fish, insinuating their way into Nissa's mind. She heard, rather than listened, absorbed the noises as she breathed in the smells. She was found at the appointed place, there at the appointed hour. She is the one. The voice was refined, cultured, but with a guttural accent which caught the vowels at the back of the throat. But the voice which answered rasped as if it was forced through broken glass. "You will send her back." "As it is written. As I remember it happening. I have seen her, and she is the one." A pause. Then the gravelled voice scraped again in the darkness. "Then the time is near. After all the millennia, a mere century, and then..." The blackness drifted in again. The mists clouded Nissa's thought and fogged her hearing. The sounds drifted away again into the distance. A few phrases, odd words found their way through the night. "The journey. The alignment will be right tonight. The stars are set. Power is building. The watchers report the museum is clear. We must return at once." Dinner was a rather muted affair. Usually, when Lord Kenilworth was recently returned from an expedition, he and his wife would talk animatedly about what had happened variously in Cairo and London over the past few months. The previous night had followed this pattern, broken only by anticipation of the unwrapping, and by Kenilworth's strange assumptions about what Atkins had been doing in his absence. But tonight, Atkins poured a little wine into his lordship's glass and listened to the silence. He had not attempted to understand why Lord Kenilworth supposed that he had accompanied him on his expedition. He must have known otherwise. And even if he did not, Lady Kenilworth was as insistent as Atkins was that Atkins had not stirred from London in the past 4 months. The conversation had been ended by Lady Kenilworth's suggestion that they talk about the impending unwrapping, and Kenilworth's half-heard mutterings that the doctor had said there would be some confusion over events. As Atkins removed the dinner plates and motioned for Beryl the maid to supply pudding bowls, he reflected that the previous night had been crystal clear by comparison. After the subdued silence of the soup and the quiet politeness of the entree, conversation had risen to new levels, and confusion with it. 4,000 years, and you say she's just asleep? Kenilworth shook his head and reached for his wine. Dashed queer business, if you ask me. It's a metabolic coma, the doctor repeated patiently, hand palmed down over his wine glass as Atkins reached forward with the bottle. Atkins moved on to Miss Jovanka. She watched glassy-eyed as he replenished her drink, and then all but drained it in a single gulp. Atkins pretended not to notice, just as he feigned disinterest in the conversation. He had heard matters from the colour of the Queen's bedroom curtains to the future foreign policy of the Empire discussed in this room, and he took it all in his measured stride. Tonight's conversation was more unsettling than others, though, perhaps because of his involvement on the fringes of yesterday's related discussions, perhaps because of the evident distress of the doctor and Miss Jovanka, perhaps because of the seemingly lifeless body lying in an ancient casket in the next room. Atkins felt that tonight he might permit himself to discuss some small aspects of the deliberations with Miss Warne when they went over the plans for the household for the following day. Dashed queer, Kenilworth repeated. Don't you think, Atkins? He added as the butler passed behind him. I'm sorry, sir. Oh, I really couldn't say. Kenilworth snorted. I must say you've clammed back up since we returned. You know I value your views on these matters. This was news to Atkins, but he nodded politely and hazarded an opinion as he was asked. If the young lady is merely asleep, sir, then could we not wake her up? Good thought, good thought. Well, Doctor? Miss Jovanka seemed to take her first interest in the conversation. Can we help her? Perhaps, Tegan. Perhaps. The doctor pushed his plate to one side, the food untouched. Atkins carefully removed it before the doctor's elbow could sink into the spotted dick. It is possible, though rather tricky. I have to break into the coma in precisely the right way, and that depends on how long Nissa has been unconscious, where she was found, what condition the sarcophagus has been in, all manner of things. Even how she was transported here is important. Ideally, the body should have been kept as level as possible. Kenilworth wiped his upper lip on a napkin. Well, of course it was, he said through the double damask. The doctor stared at him. Could I ask why? Miss Jovanka, the doctor, and Lady Kenilworth waited for the reply. Atkins contrived to fill a glass close to his lordship so as to hear properly. Kenilworth eventually finished refolding his napkin. He seemed perplexed. The sarcophagus was kept level, even to the point of stringing it up in a hammock on the return voyage, because you insisted on it, Doctor. The doctor gaped. I did? Indeed. I'm not sure I follow what's going on here, Doctor. Your memory seems as fickle as Atkins's does. The other stuff you mentioned, location and condition of the body and all that, you know already. He stood and motioned to Atkins. I think I'll take port in the drawing-room. But how? Miss Jovanka called after Kenilworth, as she got unsteadily to her feet. How does the doctor know? Kenilworth turned in the doorway. Not you too, Tegan. He knows, as you do, because he was there when we found the tomb. The carriage clattered to a halt in the snowy night. Nissa had no way of knowing how long it was since she had last been here, but she recognised the impressive stone facade of the British Museum as she was dragged roughly from the carriage. She stumbled groggily down the damp wooden steps and slipped on the cobbled street. Her foot sank through the crisp crust of ice and skidded on the slush beneath. At once she was hauled to her feet. "Gently, Yusuf, gently." Nissa found herself looking into the tanned face of a short but broadly built man in an opera cape. It was a round face, made to appear rounder by the complete lack of hair. The face was broken into a grim smile, which looked as though it was set in position. Nissa got an impression of a depth of experience which belied the apparent age of the man. Then she saw that while his skin was smooth, it was also cobwebbed with hairline cracks, like an old oil painting of a young man. He continued to smile humorlessly at her, talking over her shoulder to the man holding her arms behind her back. "The goddess did not choose this one so that you could bruise her fair skin." He reached out a calloused hand and ran a rough finger along Nissa's cheek. She flinched, tried to back away, but the man behind her held her still. "No, Yusuf, she has a better use for her than that." He stared into her eyes for a while. Nissa held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, sought refuge in the dirty white of the churned-up snow at her feet. "Does your father have other daughters?" The hand on Nissa's cheek caressed her chin, gripping it suddenly and pulling it upwards so she was forced to look into the man's face again. It was not a rough gesture, rather it was almost gentle. It would be a shame if such beauty was unique. "My father's dead." And for the first time Nissa found she really believed that. He was not coming back. He had not just gone away. Her father was dead. A short word that covered a condition that would last forever. No funeral, no time for tears, just an emptiness so deep that it ached. "Dead," Nissa repeated, and the word hung in the cold air with a blunt monosyllabic finality. The man nodded slowly. "I have heard it said that a father should not outlive his children," he said quietly, so that only Nissa heard him. Then his mouth twisted into a sudden smile and he snapped his fingers. The bald man was immediately handed a thick roll of cloth. The man gripped the hem of the cloth and let a long cloak unroll. He draped it over Nissa's shoulders and pulled it tight around her. Then he stepped back to admire the result. "There," he said. "That's better." "Who are you?" Nissa was aware that her voice was shaking. She hoped the man thought it was from the cold rather than from fear. "What do you want with me?" So many questions, so little patience. The man started to turn away. "Why have you brought me back here?" The man paused, then swung back to face her. His face was still set in its half-smile. "Oh, Nissa, Nissa," he shook his head. She gasped. "You know who I am?" "Of course. I have always known. Or, at least, it sometimes seems that way." He gave a slight bow, barely more than an inclination of his bald head. "I am Sadan Rasul, High Priest of Sutek and Nephthys, as was my father before me, and I have been waiting for you." He turned away again, cape swirling in the breeze, and started to walk slowly towards the main doors of the museum. Yusuf pushed Nissa after him, and she was aware of others following behind him. A single flake of snow landed on the smooth back of Rasul's head. It lingered for a second in the gaslight, before melting slowly into a drop of water, which ran down his hairless neck like a tear down a mourner's cheek. As she stumbled her way after Rasul, Nissa realized that the others were walking with the same measured tread as their leader. It reminded her for a moment of a ceremonial procession on Traken. It reminded her of a funeral cortege. The candles guttered and danced in the draught from the open door. The light flickered across the relics and played along the walls, It pooled on the floor, reflected off the high windows. If she had not remembered the path they had taken to get back there, Nissa might not have recognised the relic room. As she was guided in, it seemed to Nissa that every available surface hosted a candelabra. Each of the candles kept its own tiny halo within reach, allowing it to toss and twist, but never to break free of the fizzling wick. Shadows crept across the room, and then jumped back into the gloom as a flame edged towards them for a second before changing direction again. Trails of oily black smoke spiraled upwards towards the ceiling, as if rising through murky water, desperate to reach the air. The dark figures of her cloaked captors processed slowly through the room. A dark cat watched their progress with statue eyes. The dead faces painted on the sarcophagi followed their journey to the far end of the long room. Nissa let herself be carried with the tide. She could smell the acrid candle fumes, could taste the caustic smoke in the back of her dry mouth. She tried not to cough, and the effort brought tears to her eyes, tears that she had been trying to keep inside. As they neared the end of the room, Nissa could smell something else. There was a perfumed, sweet, almost sticky smell. Incense and flowers, honey and myrrh. She looked round, trying to locate the source, and out of the corner of an eye caught sight of the flicker-lit blue of the TARDIS. She gasped, taking in deep mouthfuls of the sticky sweetness. She almost laughed for joy, but the sound stuck in her throat as she was pushed forward, away from the hope of escape. Her vision was blurring, hazing over as a firm hand on her shoulder drew Nissa to a stop. She blinked back the smoky tears and saw that she was standing in front of the sarcophagus Tegan had been examining. A lifetime ago. The dark, impassive, carved face stared back at her. The arms were crossed over the chest, each hand holding a staff. Almost unconsciously, Nissa copied the gesture, bringing her cloak tighter about her. A phrase of Tegan's lingered in the back of her memory. "Cross my heart." Beside the sarcophagus stood tall incense burners, one each side. Through the increasing muzziness of the sweet haze, Nissa registered that the sticky smell was dripping from the smoking contents of the bowls of the burners. She swayed on her feet, feeling the weight of her body rock on the backs of her heels for a second. Rasul stepped in front of Nissa. He bowed low to the sarcophagus, then turned to face her. With a swift movement, he shrugged off his cape. Beneath it, his chest was bare, adorned only with a gold necklace which hung in heavy strands across his torso. Below it, he wore what looked like an ornate skirt. Nissa swayed again, as if in the breeze, and noted with a light-headed giggle that he wore sandals on his feet. The leather twisted into an oval over his toes. The shape mirrored the curled ends of the stave the sarcophagus figure held. The other figures clustered round behind Nissa, attention fixed on Rasul. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a deep, plangent tone that echoed round the room, glancing off caskets and cutting a path through the smoke and incense. "The time is now." He raised his arms above his head. "We bring the Chosen One to the gateway at the appointed time. It is as it was written, as I remember it to have been." Rasul turned back to the sarcophagus, crossing his arms across his chest, imitating the carved figure. "I make the sign of the eye, and send you a new receptacle. The Chosen One." Somewhere, deep within the sarcophagus, a hum of energy was building. A blue light flickered with the candles across the face of the casket. "From across the ages, we provide your continuing imprisonment and your ultimate release. When Orion is aligned, when power is rife, then it is said that you will live again." The noise was rising like a major chord on a large organ. The blue light strobed into a swirling vortex of colour, and the front of the sarcophagus dissolved into a whirl of light, bleeding into its dark outline. The waiting is almost over. I begin the final act. Rasul's laugh echoed over the cord. Nissa felt herself propelled towards the vortex. She struggled for a moment, but then realized that nobody was holding her. Nobody was pushing her. But in the second she looked behind, she saw a figure through the incense mist, a figure standing behind Rasul's followers, watching. The figure stepped back into the shadows as Nissa turned away again. But she had caught a glimpse of him, had seen the shadow of his ruined face. But the image that her retina retained was not the pallid glow of the moonlight on the sunken, blackened features of his face. It was the snow, clinging to his matted hair and his heavy cloak. The snow which seemed to have crystallized into a layer of ice when it should have melted in the heat from his body. Nissa was being drawn closer into the kaleidoscope of light. She clasped her hands tightly over her shoulders as the blackness closed around her, and Rasul's laughter faded into the hazy distance. "Cross my heart," Tegan's voice murmured in Nissa's ear as she fell from consciousness and into the casket. "Cross my heart and hope to die." "I'm sorry, Lord Kenilworth, but I'm going to have to ask you to trust me." The doctor clenched and unclenched his hands as he spoke. But Kenilworth snorted at his exasperation. "Well, it wouldn't be the first time, would it?" He drew on his cigar and let out a breath of smoke. It drifted across the drawing room, thinning and dissolving somewhere above the mantelpiece. "Reckon you deserve that, though, after everything?" "Yes, well," the doctor scratched his head, half stood up from where he was seated on the sofa, then sat down again. "I'd rather we didn't discuss that in any detail, if you don't mind." "Why not?" Tegan was standing on the far side of the room, arms folded, staring down into the coffin. She looked up, and the doctor had to twist in the sofa to see her properly. "What's happening here, Doctor?" She held his gaze for several seconds. "I want to know." "Well, if we're to help Nissa, there are some things I need to know, but I'm wary of knowing too much." "Not much fear of that so far." "Tegan," the doctor chided. "So, what do you want to know, eh?" Kenilworth was examining his port. He took a sip and nodded appreciatively. The doctor picked up his own glass, stared at it for a moment, then put it carefully back on the table beside him. "I must ask you to bear with me, Kenilworth. I'm going to ask you about things which you will tell me I already know. But please, answer my questions about where and when the mummy was found as best you can. And please, don't add any extra information. I only want a direct answer." Kenilworth shrugged. "Fire away, old man." The doctor turned back to Tegan. "And I'd be grateful if you could curb your natural inquisitiveness for a while, Tegan." She stared at him. "Doctor, Nissa is in the coffin here dying." Her voice had dropped an octave. "I want to know why, and I want to know how to save her." "So do I, Tegan. Believe me, so do I." The doctor heaved himself out of the sofa and crossed to her. He hesitated a moment, hand raised, then he patted her gently on the shoulder. "But there are wider implications. There's greater danger in knowing too much. We will help Nissa. I think we already have. But we can't risk damaging the web of time." "Please, Doctor," Tegan whispered. "She's all I have left." The doctor blinked. "Apart from you, I'm doing what I can, Tegan." He shook his head. "If good old Blinovitch could see me now, he'd be turning in his urn." The doctor gave a short laugh. Then he stuffed his hands into his trouser pockets and coughed, staring at the floor. "Sorry," he muttered, and turned away. A stream of bright sunlight made Nissa blink. It brought tears to her eyes, and she rubbed at them as she sat up. She found herself sitting up inside a box, or rather a casket. It looked like the same sarcophagus as she had fallen into in the British Museum, but without the lid. She looked around the room. A large glassless window allowed the sun to shine directly into the stone-floored room. A gold jug and goblet stood on a low wooden table by the door, and heavy tapestries hung across the walls. 2 chairs stood angled towards the casket, which was raised on a dais. In one of the chairs sat a man. Nissa's first thought was that it was Rasul. He wore a similar necklace and kilt, and he was completely bald. But he was older, much older. Wrinkles creased his brow, and the flesh on his chest sagged over a full belly. Behind him stood a young woman, her dark hair cut into straight lengths to her shoulders. She wore a skirt similar to the man's kilt, and an ornate halter top which looked as though it was made of gold and studded with semi-precious stones. The stones glinted in the sunlight. "Welcome," said the man. "I am Amosis, priest of the goddess." "Goddess?" The sunlight seemed less intense now that her eyes had adjusted, and Nissa glanced back towards the window. Outside, she could see the pointed silhouettes of 2 huge pyramids outlined against the horizon, the sun shining between them, hardening their edges. "And this is Citamun, handmaiden to the goddess." Amosis gestured to the woman. She smiled nervously and stepped forward so she was level with the priest's chair. "What goddess? What's going on? What is this place?" Nissa was suddenly incredibly tired. She felt herself slumping back into the casket. "Why, you are the goddess," Amosis said quietly. "Or, at least, you will be." Nissa felt the cold base of the casket hard against her back. "I welcome you as the chosen one of the gods, the new Nephthys." The Valley of the Kings, 2000 BC. The air was hot and close, sweat dripping from the stone walls of the passageway. Masood beckoned, waving the smoking torch to illuminate the way. The others stumbled after him, elation at their success so far tempered by the trepidation about what lay ahead. They had been digging for days, or rather, for nights. Long nights, hidden from the daily observations of the priest-guardians of the tomb on the far side of the valley. The tunnel was low and narrow, in contrast to the high-vaulted ceiling of the wide, sloping passageway they had intersected. Their goal, their calling, their goddess was in sight. So they stumbled onwards, oblivious to the heat and the humidity, not caring about the stale air or the darkness. They feared only the goddess and failure. The heavy doors were sealed with a crimson rope. It was tied tightly around the huge handles, knotted and dipped in wax. The decay of the ages clung to the cord, and it exploded in a cloud of dust and frayed fragments as Masood cut through it with his knife. With a backward glance to his comrades, sufficient to gain their confidence and approval, but not enough to be infected by their anxiety and fear, he pushed against the heavy double doors. And, with a creak of ancient protest, they swung slowly open. The Eye of Horus watched unblinking, disapproving, from where it was inlaid in the passage floor. A faint glow suffused the air around the ornate pupil, a reflection perhaps of the torches above it as they clustered in the doorway. Then Masood stepped tentatively over the threshold, and the eye at his feet flashed brilliant red. The wind ripped through the passage like a typhoon. Masood was the only one of them inside the doorway, and yet the hurricane that erupted from inside seemed to sweep past him. He staggered forwards in the eye of the gale, while his comrades were blown against the passage walls. He was oblivious to their fate as he battled his way onwards into the tomb. Behind him, Masood's brother, Ahmed, crashed into one of the open doors. Blood streamed from his face as he collapsed back onto the floor and tumbled away. Thutmose, the camel trader, clawed at the cracks between the stone slabs on the floor, his fingers tearing and the skin rippling on his cheeks. He clung on for several seconds, then bounced down the corridor like a Shabti doll hurled from the tomb doorway. Within the tomb, Masood struggled onwards. He was leaning into the wind, his loose clothing blown back against his body as he inched forwards. As he reached the sarcophagus, he lost his footing and crashed to the floor. His knee crunched on the flagstones and he screamed in pain. But he dragged himself onwards, so close now, so close. In front of him, he could see the relics placed on low shelves round the head of the casket. He could see the canopic jar, its stopper carved in the shape of the head of Anubis the jackal. The god's ceramic eyes watched his progress unblinking. Masood's hand reached out towards the jar, and the red glow from the passageway outside seemed to grow stronger even as the screams of his friends died away. With a final effort, Masood hurled himself forward. His fingertips connected with the stopper, and the jar tottered for a long second. The wind dropped, as if holding its breath with Masood, while the jar rolled on its base and rocked back again. It teetered off the rim, then slipped from the low shelf into space. The wind returned, stronger than ever. Masood was swept against the wall of the tomb, the back of his head smashing against the carved stone and splitting open like a rotten egg. The last thing Masood saw before he died was the canopic jar rolling towards him across the floor of the tomb. It was still intact, but a dark crack ran the length of it. Perhaps it was enough. Enough for him to pass through the hall of the two truths, and for the goddess to welcome him to the afterlife. The jar rolled itself to a halt against Masood's face. The glazed eyes of Anubis stared into those of the grave robber, and the wind died away. The jar rocked slightly in a growing, viscous pool of blood, and darkness returned. Rasul woke suddenly. His head felt like it was splitting, and through the crack in his mind he could feel something forcing its way in. Was it guilt? Anger? He did not need to ask himself what he should feel guilt or anger about, and that acceptance of the truth was itself unusual. He rose stiffly from his wooden bed and went to the window. He was alone, of course. He had not shared his bed since his only wife had died in childbirth. So long ago now. So alone for so long. Outside, the pyramid stood stark against the night sky. A jackal called out somewhere in the distance. A long, lonely wail. As he turned to go back to bed, he saw a figure standing in the shadows by the door. He could not see who it was, but the servants all knew better than to disturb him without good cause. But before Rasul could say anything, the figure spoke. Its voice was cracked, like an old flute playing in the wind. The tomb was broken into tonight. Robbed? Rasul did not need to ask which tomb. Only one mattered, the tomb he lived to protect. No, the figure said. The robbers did not complete their task. The gods be thanked. But they have started something that must be finished. What do you mean? Rasul was worried now. For a second he saw the hourglass, sand dripping from the upper bowl as it sifted through the seconds of eternity. Why had none of the priests alerted him to the events if the robbers had been disturbed? Who are you, and how do you know this? He demanded. The figure rattled a laugh. A jar was cracked. The priests are discovering it even now, binding it with Hessian and praying for guidance. They will come to you soon for advice. You are the one chosen to watch over the tomb, the one granted the lonely years of vigil. They fear for their lives and for the life of Egypt. Cracked. Rasul could taste the same fear. He knew how the priests would be feeling. But not broken. No. The voice sounded almost sad. But the crack is enough. The process begins. Your own feelings are proof enough of the power of the goddess. My feelings? Rasul stepped back a pace. The guilt and anger had made him shout, had confessed the truth of what the man said. "Your feelings," the voice repeated, "and my presence." A sudden thought occurred to Rasul. Wait, how did they get past the test of the Shabti? The figure's laugh was a dry, rasping death rattle. "We were told the answer before we entered the tomb." "You? Who by? Only one person knows the secret of the riddle." "Exactly. One who serves the goddess, and yet knows it not. One who will be her servant in the empty years ahead, now that the chain of events is started, now that the inevitable is set on its course." The crack in Rasul's head seemed to split wide open. He could see clearly for the first time, knew his destiny. And he remembered meeting the man in the marketplace, recalled slipping him the papyrus on which he had scrawled the answer. Sadan Rasul, the only living man to know the secret of the riddle. But until now, he had not known his own purpose. The figure's croaking voice broke into his realization. "You know what you must do. You have always known. And now is the time." "A replacement vessel," Rasul murmured. But he knew that they must find another form of container. The canopic jar could not be repaired or imitated. They would have to pray that the gods again provided the means to their ends. "Yes," the figure in the shadows hissed. "You see, already the spirit of the goddess is within you. You will be a good servant to her in the long, lonely ages ahead." The figure reached out its hand towards Rasul. It was holding something, gesturing for him to take it. "Me?" Rasul was aghast. "But why me? Why not you?" Yet even as he questioned how he would come to serve the one he was sworn to keep in thrall, he knew that the shadowy figure spoke the truth. And he took the hourglass the figure was holding out to him, the sands spiralling down into the lower bowl. He had known already what he had to do, had known since the tomb was sealed, and he had started the hourglass sands on their courses. It was the only way he would ever... The figure broke into his thoughts again. "I am not fit for the years that lie ahead, for the waiting and the planning." The final words were almost a gasp as the figure collapsed. "I am dead already." It fell forwards into the room, making no attempt to save itself or break the fall. The body landed with a dull thud at Rasul's feet. Outside, he could hear the commotion as the messenger from the priests hammered on the door and demanded to be let in. He could hear the servants moving around downstairs and the bolts being drawn. And at his feet, sudden in a shaft of moonlight, he could see the dark mass of congealed blood. It caked the back of the head of what had once been a man. The skull was smashed inwards, split open like a rotten egg.